I just wanted to start off with the economy, and we have Charles Nenner out there, Harry Dent, Cliff High, Jim Rogers. They're all saying that something bad is going to happen the latter part of this year. And when you look at the economy and you look around and you see what's happening, what's your take on what's going on right now?
Well, I would always caution against this something bad's going to happen later on this year. You know, the old adage was back when I began as a stockbroker back in the early 90s was you never wanted to give date and price in the same sentence. You know, to say that Walmart's going to 40 sounds pretty good, but when you say Walmart's going to 40 by Christmas is a whole other story. And so if the world doesn't end or there's bad things that happen by the end of this year, I'm sure Harry and all the rest will come back with another forecast for 2018. But I am wary, though, of what I continually call the generally accepted narrative. And we're getting a dose of it again here this morning with Mother Felon in front of the Senate Banking Committee with her Humphrey Hawkins testimony. There's this narrative that's been promoted heavily ever since the election of Trump that this 2017 was an easily predictable year. It's no problem at all. The dollar's going to get stronger and interest rates are going to go up and the bond bubble is going to burst and the stock market's going to go higher, as if it was all just a fait accompli. And maybe it will be. I mean, there are a lot of smart people that think that. I tend to be a little more contrarian in nature and think that when everyone is on the same side of the trade, usually it doesn't go that direction. So far in 2017, it's played out that way, though now the dollar and the dollar yen are bouncing back up a little bit. But, the dollar at one point was down almost 4% year to date before this little bounce began. About a week or so ago. So we'll see. We'll see if it's as simple as everybody leads you to believe. All these rate hikes are getting priced in. We've been promised rate hikes since 2009?
Yeah.
And so far we've gotten one each over the last 2 years. I'm going to have to see it to believe it. I just don't know if 2017 will play out in the manner that everybody seems to expect it will.
Now, Trump, as he came into office, and actually when he was campaigning, he was talking about, bringing back jobs, manufacturing, other jobs, keeping jobs from going overseas. And he talked to Carrier, Ford, GM, and a lot of these companies, they're still taking the jobs and moving them to Mexico. They haven't really changed anything. Now, as Trump is continually out there saying this, do you think with the current economy, do you think he can actually bring the jobs back to the U.S.? Will that even make a difference?
Well, that's what you wonder about. Frankly, this may sound like really way out there, whacked out, but I've always thought, in a sense, some of the job exporting was actually related in a way to the petrodollar scheme. You know how the Kissinger came up with that back in the early 70s. If we would always price energy in dollars, there'll always be demand for dollars, and those dollars that we print here will get incubated and recycled and all that kind of stuff. And I think the tax structure of the U.S. was also set up in a similar manner, so that if we continue to offload manufacturing and get goods to be manufactured in other, parts around the world, other places around the world where they can be manufactured less expensively and then shipped here, that is also a way to kind of incubate dollars, ship dollars overseas when we buy these other countries' goods, and again, get them all incubated. Look, I'm no tenured economist, so I haven't written papers on this kind of thing, but that's just always been my idea. And so I wonder if, if he'd be successful in remaking the U.S. economy, and can any president actually do that? And if it isn't too far gone, and if that system isn't already so entrenched that there's not much he can do, lowering the corporate taxes and trying to, I guess as they call it, repatriate these funds that are held overseas by these U.S. corporations and have those dollars come back so that the government can tax them. I wonder about that almost from an inflationary standpoint. I don't know if it'd be significant enough that it would cause much inflation, but a lot of these things that he's talking about are it's really difficult to predict how it might all play out should it come to pass. And which I guess kind of gets back to what we talked about in the first question. Is it really that predictable and straightforward as to how a Trump administration is going to play out?
If we listen to what Mario Draghi, Christine Lagarde, and Fitch just currently, they said, oh, yeah, Trump's economic policies, what they're forecasting is that the economy might, suffer under this. And if the economy, not just here in the United States, but globally, start to deteriorate, it's because of Trump's policies. And Mario Draghi said this, Christine Lagarde said this, Fitch said this. And to me, it sounds like they're kind of setting him up to take the fall for the economy deteriorating as we move forward.
Yeah, and on that kind of similar note, Dave, Trump has as his chief trade advisor, I think is the guy's title, a gentleman by the name of Peter Navarro. Mm-hmm. And this guy set his sights in a couple of places already. That Trump has talked about Mexico and a border tax and tariffs and things like that. And then Navarro himself was out talking about the ECB and the euro and how the euro is undervalued versus the dollar. And that kind of rocked the currency markets one day a couple of weeks ago. Well, this cat Navarro, besides being I guess he's a Harvard economist, he's an author. And two of his, I guess, more popular books, one is called The China Wars. And then the second one is called Death by China. And it's like, well, okay, how long before this guy turns his sights on China? And, if you want to call him the biggest currency manipulator, I would say the Japanese are probably the biggest currency manipulators, but with the way that PBOC pegs the yuan to the dollar, I think it's probably just a matter of time before that gets shoved to the forefront, and Trump's trade policies vis-a-vis China and the tariffs and things like that he discussed during the campaign. You just don't know how some of this stuff is going to play out, how it's going to be received, not only in the markets, but interpreted by the computers that run all the markets. It would just have to wait and see. And I'll give you one more thing too, Dave. There was one thing that really moved everything one day last week was when Trump mentioned something about, his huge tax cuts that were coming, and they were going to be spectacular, and we'd have something in 2 or 3 weeks. And that sent the dollar, screaming higher and that kind of thing. And that's like as if he's just going to wave a magic wand in 2 or 3 weeks and these things are going to happen and the effects on the economy are going to be instantaneous. He might have a plan. He might have a couple of ideas he puts forth, but that stuff's got to go through Congress. And then it all has to then eventually take effect. And most of it wouldn't take effect immediately if it even did get passed. I mean, we're talking late this year, next year. And then by the time any of that trickled down to the actual economy, it's another couple of quarters. But yet these markets these days, again, as they're all run by computers and all these computers scan the headlines, I guess I'll just draw back again to where we began. I think we have to be kind of cautious with all of this stuff because we just don't know, one, what Trump will suggest, how that will affect all the different global markets.
No, that's true. I wanted to move on to gold right now. And last time you were on, we talked about Germany repatriating their gold. They wanted 300 tons, and it looks like that has been completed. It looks like they got all their gold back. But I don't know if you saw this, but something was very interesting about the gold bars they received. They had different labels on the bars than what they had before. And that is kind of strange. Does that tell you something? Does that mean that maybe the Fed really didn't have the gold?
Right.
What does that say to you?
Well, that was kind of the thought at the time. That's always been part of it. And then, if I recall right, in the first 6 or 7 metric tons that they pulled out in 2013, they immediately had them recast. Isn't that how that initially worked? I mean, they shipped them to some refinery in Germany or Switzerland and had them recast and all that. And people thought, was the U.S. just kind of fending off some of their old coin melt bars from the 1930s, that were 90% purity? There just have always been all these questions surrounding that German repatriation schedule. And, as you talk about Europe and Germany, that's certainly an interesting item. But as we look forward into this year, I think perhaps even more compelling will be the demand for physical from just everyday Europeans. Because one of the things that hasn't changed is obviously Brexit is moving forward now. We're going to have a vote. Well, we had the vote of the House of Commons was last week, and now the House of Lords will be back. I think it's a week from Friday, and they'll begin whatever they do to eventually give Prime Minister May the approval to go ahead with Article 50 and Brexit. And then we've got everything that's going on in Greece rearing its ugly head again. We got the continuing problems in Italy, and we got Marine Le Pen kind of riding the same wave that Trump rode. There are real threats to the European Union and this single European currency. And so if you're a regular European, wherever you live, Luxembourg or Belgium or whatever, and you're faced with a kind of a double whammy of negative or zero interest rates on your savings in euros, but then a devaluing euro because, it may be going the way of the dodo bird. You look at that and you think, well, I've got to have an alternative for how I'm going to hold my savings. And I think that could be a real significant grassroots demand for physical gold in the months ahead. And that's another story for 2017 that people need to really keep an eye on.
Yeah, you mentioned the Brexit and the EU and a lot of the other countries. Most likely they'll have some type of referendum saying we don't want to be part of the EU. We see it's heading toward that direction. And Germany, like we just mentioned, was asking for all their gold back. Why do you think they accelerated the process of getting the gold back to their country? Do they know something?
Yeah, that makes you wonder, doesn't it? Because again, now we're speculating here, and there could be any one of a number of reasons, but that's certainly in the ballpark of rationale, isn't it? That they would think, yeah, they were going to play ball and wait their 7 years to get their 300 tons, and then they could see these dominoes falling into each other, and they said, wait a second, hold on just a minute, you better give us that gold now, because there's all this turbulence on the horizon. Yeah, no doubt about it. We talk about Grexit and Brexit and Frexit for France and Italy for Italy. There are a lot of, really, if you just take yourself back 3 or 4 years, just the structural problems, of the northern euro area basically paying for and covering the debts of the southern euro area. We had all these talks about whether the euro would split apart just based on those structural problems. And now you got countries just wanting to leave the euro. That could be, at least I'm holding out hope that it will be one of the key drivers of physical gold demand that finally breaks apart it's really a scheme, a paper derivative pricing scheme that has held for the metals since, the mid 70s. It's what we're all waiting for. And something like that, it could be finally enough significant demand of people wanting it in their own hands, not wanting to play in the unallocated system, not wanting just shares of some ETF, not wanting a pooled account at UBS, but actually wanting the real thing in their own safe because it's such a time of monetary change. That could be enough to really upset the apple cart that the bullion banks have been pushing along now for 40 some odd years.
You mentioned gold and the precious metals market, and we saw the manipulation with like Deutsche Bank and other banks, and they paid fines and things like that, but nothing really happened. It looks like the manipulation is continuing, like nothing's really changed. Gold moves up and down just a little bit, and every time it starts to move up, all of a sudden it's pushed right back down into this area. It really hasn't gone anywhere for a very long time. And go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dave. I didn't mean to interrupt you. So please.
No, I was just one thing I was going to say was Cliff High was saying when I was having an interview with him that silver is going to be a very close relationship to gold later on. And it's going to be, worth almost as much as gold.
That, it would be interesting to see if it gets to that point. When I look at the silver market, and if you could see me right now, I'm making like the little quotation marks with my fingers, like people do when I say the word market. It's a great example of uneconomic pricing because, I mean, heck, at $18 an ounce, silver is basically the same price that it was in the late 70s, I mean, 40 years ago. Everybody says, well, silver is a great hedge against inflation and all this kind of, it's a commodity and commodities go up as inflation, all that. Really? 40 years? How about that? Yeah. What else has not gone up for 40 years? Silver is about it. And why is that? It is because the market that is used to come up with a price for silver has nothing to do with the actual exchange of physical silver. The price is instead set on these electronic derivative exchanges. And then people accept that price that's discovered for these derivatives as the price for the spot physical. It doesn't make any sense. Again, in these derivatives markets, like right now, the COMEX in New York has a total open interest of silver contracts of 195,000 contracts. Each contract represents 5,000 ounces. So we're talking 975 million virtual digital ounces of silver that are available on the COMEX. There's not 975 million ounces of silver on the COMEX. I mean, and the silver that's there, half of it's controlled by JP Morgan, but that's a whole other story. What is there is 975 million virtual ounces. Heck, Dave, the world only produces as annual supply about 880 million ounces. So how is it that the exchange where price is discovered can have 110% of global supply in open interest? And at the end of the day, it's this unlimited creation, this infinite creation of these derivative contracts that has led to a distortion in what should be an economically viable price for silver. The two symbols of that distortion are the ongoing supply deficit. You get those numbers now. I mean, it depends on who you talk to. Steve St. Angelo would tell you we've been in a silver supply deficit now for the last 15 years. Even more, I guess we'll call it conservative outlets like Thomson Reuters or GFMS would say at least the last 5 years we've been in a supply deficit for silver. And on another level, it's that pricing structure that explains a gold-silver ratio of 70-1 or whatever the hell it is at this point. I mean, for time immemorial, it's been, 12-1, 16-1? And now suddenly it's 70-1. Well, why is it 70-1? Because again, the price that you're using in that ratio is not determined by the physical exchange of silver. Oh, sure, there's silver exchange at that price, but the price that's used is determined by the supply and demand of the derivative. I mean, it's a convoluted scheme that is rife with corruption, as you mentioned, with insider trading and manipulation and fraud. And unfortunately, it's the system we have until it finally breaks. Now, what you mentioned, though, is the right thing to do is to understand that this price is inaccurate, uneconomic, whatever you want to call it, and then use that to your advantage and then just wait until the system finally collapses under the weight of the deceit and the fraud.
No, that's true. And I mean, right now, it's so cheap that you should be hoarding it. You should be buying as much as you possibly can because, eventually the system will break. I mean, if you just look around and you can see all the economic data, I'm not talking about the stock market. I'm talking about the real economic data with retail contracting, GDP manipulated, unemployment manipulated. I mean, really, we're living in an economic illusion right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is actually going to crush away the illusion and things are going to change dramatically. When is that going to happen? Don't exactly know. But it seems like as we move, month to month to month, it seems like, you can tell that things aren't going as planned because, they blame, retail on the weather, but retail continually contracts. GDP never got over 3%. I think it was on average like 1.8% throughout the whole year. And that's the manipulated number.
Yeah.
And unemployment, there's companies still laying off. I just saw Credit Suisse going to be laying off another 6,500 people today.
Right. And Dave, I'll give you a number that can't be fudged, or I guess is maybe more difficult to fudge because it's not just statistical guesswork. Late, I guess it was Friday, Treasury budget came out and they noted the tax receipts for December.
Yep.
I think it was either December, January. I believe it was December. And, there was headlines. I saw some stories actually even Monday that said, U.S. tax receipts hit a record and all this kind of stuff. But the way you have to look at it, though, is year over year. And year over year, tax receipts have fallen. And that right there is, tax rates haven't changed. And so if you want a real measure of economic activity and employment and all that kind of stuff, U.S. federal government tax receipts is a great way to look at it. Zero Hedge noted this on Friday. They put up a chart showing that over the last 5 occasions, when tax receipts year over year have moved into negative, it has always been a precursor of recession. So these the BLS and all the other government agencies can sit there and crank out their statistical guesswork of how many jobs were added, and all that kind of jazz. And Mother Yellen can talk all about, the robust economy at full employment when we have 95 million people not in the labor force and all that kind of stuff. But when it gets down to brass tacks and you actually see hard data that really can't be fudged, those tax receipts, you realize, maybe the U.S. economy isn't really humming along as much as they would lead you to believe.
That's absolutely true. I just wanted to get quickly for the last part here. I want to talk about geopolitical things happening around the world. Right now we see Trump is telling, China, be careful. We're going to, sail our ships in the South China Sea. We see Iran, things are heating up there. Ukraine, we see war is heating up there. Kim Jong-un's brother, Kim Jong-nam, he was assassinated, murdered, something. He died. He was 45. And someone saying that there were 2 women, they stuck him with this needle or something, and then they left the area. So to me, it seems like there are other powers, forces at work here trying to push us maybe into a war. Do you see any of that?
Yeah, we follow that really closely at TF Metals Report. And I saw the thing on Kim Jong-un's brother. I hate to make light of the guy because he's dead, but he got a pretty good deal. He had to figure his time was, numbered. Any sunrise he saw, he had to figure, I didn't expect to wake up today, because eventually he had to figure his brother was going to come get him. To get stuck with poison and just drop dead is a much better fate than Uncle General June, who I think they strapped to a slab of concrete and mortared, right? Remember that?
Yep.
So this guy, at least he was nice enough to his brother to just hit him with some poison. Anyway, I don't know how that's going to play out. They're shooting off missiles and the Iranians are doing their thing. My most grave concern, and we've chronicled it at TF Metals Report now for 3 years, is the situation in Ukraine and the war party, as we call it, of the West that is doing everything they can to, it seems, to provoke some type of conflict with Russia. And now, 3 years on, war seems to be heating up again in the southeast of Ukraine, where the Kiev government, with help from NATO and U.S. advisors, is up against these they call them separatists, but they're just regional southeast Ukrainians that don't want any part of the Kiev government. And now we've got both sides at loggerheads down there. I think that's a very dangerous situation. In the time since that was originally kind of beginning to draw headlines 3 years ago, now NATO and the U.S. have positioned troops into the Baltics, into Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, was so basically directly on Russia's western border. That is the first time since June of 1941 that potentially hostile troops have been directly upon Russia's western border. That's why they had the Iron Curtain, right? They pushed their borders out to Poland and East Germany and all the rest to keep troops off their border. Why, if you're a Russian that with any knowledge of history, at the last time there were foreign hostile troops right on your border 75 years ago, that didn't turn out so well. That led to 26.3 million dead Russians. And so you kind of remember that stuff. And believe me, the Russians remember that stuff. And so us putting troops there, because we're going to stop that rascally Putin, that just isn't, that's looked at in a totally different light than what the American media portrays it as here. And so I think that's again, we'll just put that in the wild card category for 2017. And if anything that we need to be hopeful and pray about is that doesn't flare up into what could conceivably be the worst conflict, worst global scare since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This notion that 2017, is going to be great, man. The stock market's going to 25,000 and the dollar's going to king dollar and the interest. I mean, as if, again, it's all just a fait accompli. And I would just suggest that maybe things are a little more complicated than that, and that people need to be a little more contrarian to the generally accepted narrative of what life